when you need it the most. Grammarly Go brings AI
big crowd tonight. To call the Planning Commission for May 18th, 2023 to order. Would the clerk please take roll?
Jonathan Shelkey. Here. Jerry DiTullio.
Here.
Christine Disney.
Here.
Julianne Stern.
Here.
Patrick Quinn.
Here.
Daniel Larson.
Here.
Janet Leo. And Will Kearns is absent tonight.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like to welcome our new commission member, Patrick Quinn. Welcome. District 3. Welcome. Does anybody like to change the agenda order tonight, or any changes? So the agenda will stand as posted. Does anybody like to make a changes to the minutes of April 6, 2023? Then the minutes will stand as published. We'll move on to public forum. Do we have anybody here to speak under public comment on any item not on the agenda, either in the room or on Zoom?
It does not look like it on Zoom. It's possible there's one person. If you, oh, nope, we are good.
Okay. We'll move on to public hearings. I'm going to open the public hearing, and 7A is case number ZOA 23-05, an ordinance amending Article 9 of the Chapter 26 of the Wheatridge Code of Laws concerning requirements for mixed-use zoning districts. We'll move on to a staff presentation first.
Thank you. Good evening. For the record, Lauren Michalak, Community Development Director. Scott Cutler, one of our senior planners, mentioned it was a meeting or two ago that we had a variety of code amendments coming your way. And that work is ongoing, but 3 of those are here tonight. Scott has done the heavy lifting on these, but he is on a well-deserved vacation. So I'm presenting these all tonight from the table, no slides, just a few verbal comments from me, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. So this first one is related to the mixed-use code, and some of you may know that we created the mixed-use codes in 2010, and the purpose of creating that article was to reduce the city's historic kind of over-reliance on planned developments. So the purpose was to codify really clear and specific standards that would result in high-quality design and not leave anything to the imagination for developers. We have very explicit setbacks and build-tos and transition zones. There's almost no room for negotiation. There's a lower allowance for variances in mixed-use districts compared to the whole rest of the city. It was an extensive process in 2009 and 10 to create those districts. We had focus groups, we had design professionals kind of informing some of the design standards. We had community members involved, task forces, and basically we've had over a decade of experience now implementing those codes. What it looks like is a developer or property owner submitting a site plan that has to demonstrate compliance with mixed-use codes. Those are reviewed by staff only. That was part of the premise of the mixed use, is to remove the need for a public hearing by giving a very explicit rule book and saying you either meet it or you don't. That said, with 10 years of experience, we've been keeping a running list of lessons learned, some things that probably could be refined to better meet the intent of those districts, to give us better authority when we are going back and forth with the developer with comment letters, to codify some of the things that we put into policy. And essentially, what you have tonight is 10 different topics that all relate to the mixed-use code that we're just trying to refine. There's no major changes. There's no major sort of different frameworks. The staff report itemizes every item. I'm not going to go through all 10 of those. But in short, it's a variety of kind of clarifications and updates, and I'm happy to respond to any questions. The staff report is organized in the same sequence as they appear in the ordinance. And for those of you for ordinances, we've seen a few, but as you know, the bold and underlined text represents the new content in an ordinance. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commission questions. I'll go to my right. Commissioner Leo. Commissioner Stern. Commissioner Disney. Commissioner Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with the height and density cross-reference, please.
Yes.
Height and density, had to cross and put all density and height references in one place.
Yes.
Does moving them to one place change any of the specs?
No. I can explain that a little bit more if that would help. So I think most of you probably know that here in the city of Wheat Ridge, we have a height and density cap in our city charter. If you go into the online code or the hard copy code, the charter sort of is before chapter 1 of the code of laws. It's fine, it lives there, but what happens is a prospective buyer or developer skims our code and doesn't see a height or density cap in the mixed-use zone district. So we just needed to make it more clear where they would find that. We have a lot of people that come to us with these projects that are way too dense because they missed where they would find that height and density cap. So what's nice about our online code is every time you see a section, like in this one, it says City Charter Section 5.10.1, they hyperlink that, so you can't miss it. So that's what that text edition will do.
Thank you. And then under building placement and orientation standards requiring public-facing entrances in transit-oriented districts to increase build-to requirements, does that mean that the build-to will require the building to be closer to the street?
It's a good question. So build-to requirements have two standards. One is how close something has to be to the street, and the second is the percentage of the frontage that needs to contain a building. So we're not changing the distance of the building to the property line, but we are saying more of the building needs to be in that area. So it's a slightly more urban environment.
I'm sorry, more of the building needs to be in,
The build-to area.
okay. And build-to simply means the
The-
building has to occupy this space.
Yep, which is usually an area of either 0 to 12 feet or 0 to 20 feet.
Okay. Vertical screening requirements, I'm missing something here. Is it says the Architectural Site and Design Manual requires screening of parking lots and drive-throughs. And the mixed-use sections vary, 42 to 46 inches. Does this also apply to the mechanical units on top of buildings, or is that in a separate section?
I think that's a separate section. That has been something that we've discussed. That's in the architectural section.
Got you, okay. So what this section does here is it standardizes the height
Yes.
that the screen needs to be,
Yes.
okay? Building materials, what are the changes there?
A few changes related to building materials. So we have, as a city, taken a pretty flexible approach. We don't have like a prescriptive style of architecture. Like you go to Lone Tree and it's Lone Tree beige, and that's a requirement of the city. We don't have color requirements, we don't have style requirements, but we do have requirements in terms of the quality of the material. We've been allowing siding. It's not a prohibited material, but it's also not explicitly listed. So we want to be more clear about how siding or board and batten is permitted. We've had some projects like West End 38 that's more of a classical brick architecture. And the code actually doesn't really allow that right now because it requires changes in material. So we want to acknowledge that there's good architecture in classical brick buildings. So we have that in there. Fuel canopies need to have more strict architectural requirements, particularly related to the poles that hold up the canopy. We have been successful, for the most part, in extracting that, but there's not a code basis for that. So we put that in there, requiring that at least 2/3 of the pole holding a canopy has sort of a primary material, it's not just wrapped metal. There are some brick materials that are not, that are synthetic, and we need to understand better. Some are crappy and some are fine, and so we ask for material samples, but we want to make that clear in the code that we sort of have discretion over what's approved or not from a synthetic standpoint. Transparency has been really challenging with newer developments lately, because as you push a building to the street, you end up with back-of-house functions. You think about the corners, for example. You enter the smoothie shop or the dentist or Tokyo Joe's from the parking lot, and so all those windows along Wadsworth, they need some bathrooms, they need back-of-house. So we need to have a little bit more allowance for spandrel glazing or non-functional windows that look like windows to the passerby but allow the business to operate. And then the last piece in there is rooftop screening, which you mentioned earlier. There's a couple businesses, you might have known, if you were perceptive at Esther's at Gold's Market, we went a little bit back and forth on their rooftop screening. It changed 3 times over the last couple months. We just needed a better code basis for how we expect rooftop equipment to be screened. And so we've clarified that based on some of our recent projects.
Well, getting back to the use of brick, did I read correctly where you've had instances where the developer thought that what the code was asking for was brick here and stucco over here and brick there and all kinds of, like a crazy quilt? And
Yes. Yes, that's what the code requires now, is a change in material, so you don't get sort of a flat 3-story product. We've interpreted that to mean, to allow a project like West End, where it was clearly meeting the intent of high-quality architecture, and now this code amendment would sort of more clearly allow that to happen.
Okay, and then on the fuel canopies, I'm trying to think, you mentioned the 7-Eleven at 38th and Harlan. There is a new 7-Eleven going up at 44th and Harlan, but I guess that would be Lakeside. Yeah. And I was just by there the other day, and there's no brick wrapped around the base of that canopy.
Yeah,
Was this something that people asked for?
we do, because
Just
think they look
aesthetically, or is there
better.
some sort of structural reason, or?
no structural reason.
Okay.
You'll never look at a gas canopy the same way once you've started thinking about how the poles are wrapped. There are some gas stations that look better than others, and if the intent of the mixed-use code is to sort of elevate the standards, and that's what we felt like we needed to do.
It's not a big ask, I suppose, of a company like 7-Eleven. But if they were building, if the city of Wheat Ridge encompassed 44th and Harlan on the northeast corner, that 7-Eleven would have the brick around, is it the bottom 2/3?
We would ask for it, and we'd get pushback because it's not in the code, sort of unless and until this
Okay.
changes. Yeah.
Okay. Rooftop screening seems pretty straightforward. This isn't like, would it be retroactive if somebody was going to replace the mechanical on top of the roof?
Yes, if you're replacing the mechanical, it would apply. Like Mestizo, if you drive by Mestizo on Harlan and you look, you'll notice they have some sort of wood slats. It's not a new building, but they replace their mechanical.
And typically that's around the edge of the building or closer to the mechanical unit? Or?
Closer to the unit in most cases.
Yeah.
People don't like to make perforations in their roof, which we understand, but sort of the closer it is, the fewer holes they have to punch in the roof to make that happen.
Oh, that makes sense. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Commissioner Quinn? Nothing at this time. Commissioner Shelkey?
A couple questions. One is the bicycle parking requirements. So it says the bicycle parking and storage requirements will be increased to be more in line with surrounding communities. What does that mean?
We don't require as much bicycle parking as we think we should, especially in multi-unit projects. And so we're doing a little bit right now because we know we have some projects in the queue that we want to catch. And council has asked us to study bike parking and EV parking more extensively, so that'll take a little bit more time. So our goal here was to make sort of quick amendments to existing code and then come back and study it further, which could add more requirements in terms of indoor storage or secured outdoor storage or how you are allowed to park bikes in a parking garage. But yeah, 13 years ago when mixed use was adopted, it was just sort of a different environment in terms of bikes and frankly in terms of how many multi-unit projects we had developed in the city. So we think we're more in line with these changes.
Okay, so the intent is to take a look at what other communities are doing and
Yes.
kind of come up to speed.
Yes.
Okay. Can you clarify the walking path language? I was a little confused when I read
Sure,
that.
yeah. The mixed-use code requires that a certain amount of your landscaped or open space area be usable, so that we don't just end up with, small islands in a parking lot and they call it good. What we have enforced, basically since day one on the mixed-use code, you're allowed to have a sidewalk be 4 feet wide and still meet accessible standards, but 4 feet once you've got a dog or a kid or a grocery bag is not, we've deemed that to be not usable. And we've gotten pushback on that too because we've just made that as an interpretation. So we wanted to codify that you have to have at least 5 feet for it to count as usable. And on some of these sites, they've had a hard time meeting the usable open space requirement, so we go back and forth quite a bit on that because some projects are sort of just barely meeting it, and that's okay, but it needs to be functional. So that's why we're codifying that width.
So this is an encouragement to have the 5-foot wide sidewalks?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it has to be a walking loop, so that can end up to be a lot of linear feet of sidewalk. And in some cases, folks will routinely, they're not being rude, they're just, they'll say like, where in the code does it say it needs to be 5 feet? And we don't have that right now, so gives us a little bit more ammunition.
Just more and more you're seeing the 6-foot wide
For sure.
as
Yes.
becoming more of the standard.
Yes.
If you want to use it
Yes.
for recreation.
Yeah, and in a planned development, I would expect that that's that kind of negotiation of like, we can do better, and that's kind of the point. But in the mixed use code, I think, in a lot of the projects that you've seen coming up around town, they've got 5 feet because we've pushed them. We'd love to push them further.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess the question I had is, do you see any major changes to the drive-through? Is it going to be less restrictive or the same or more restrictive to have a drive-through?
The more restrictive component is that it wouldn't be allowed in our transit oriented zone district.
And is there any reason why we're limiting that?
I think because the primary intent of that zone district, it's a limited area, we get one train station, is to really make sure that it's pedestrian oriented. Most of the property in that area along Ward is not zoned mixed use, so it wouldn't be an issue. But if if Toll Brothers ends up with a small commercial piece close to the station, which they could because they approved a concept plan with a commercial piece, we don't want that real estate, a stone throw from the station to be a mini drive-through. That's just not the intent of that zone district in that location.
So what areas of Wheat Ridge are we talking about?
The only properties that are zoned mixed-use commercial transit-oriented development are immediately adjacent to the Wheat Ridge Ward commuter rail station.
Do we have any other questions before I close the public hearing and take a motion? Mr. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the, that final section, drive-through and gas station separation requirements, I spent a little time on Google trying to find locations within the city of Wheat Ridge that, where you have gas stations right now that would not be allowed under this new ordinance, and there's only 2 that I can find, both on 44th. So it's not like the city is experiencing a growth in gas stations.
I'm not sure that we've had too many more than sort of average pace. So the separation requirement was built into the original adoption of the mixed-use code. And the intent was to recognize that in our mixed-use areas, so predominantly Wadsworth and 38th Avenue, we want to balance our land uses so they're not predominantly auto-oriented. So they're not disallowed, but they have to be separated so they're not every corner. What the code didn't do is clarify how do we measure that, and we have a policy that we very quickly adopted in 2011-ish, and so this codifies that policy to explain how we've been measuring it. We haven't actually had it come up too often. I think there was maybe where the Chase Bank, I think, put a drive-through ATM in King Soopers parking lot on 38th near Sheridan. And I think there was one other bank that wanted to add a drive-through that couldn't, and they moved a little further down. It doesn't come up very often.
Right.
But-
Lauren, if at Clear Creek Crossing, there was probably one of the first new gas stations that's opened in Wheat Ridge in a while. And I did a quick measure on Google, and that is 900 feet from the Phillips on the
Yep.
corner of 32nd. Would that have been allowed under this?
So it's not in the mixed-use zone, so it's sort of
It's,
moved.
it's not.
Yeah, no. But Clear Creek Crossing is planned development.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. And as I read through it, the issue of interstate proximity,
What's that?
the interstate, proximate to Interstate 70, there's some differences and different interpretations.
Right, yeah, I think there's an understanding that mixed-use commercial interstate is intended to accommodate interstate supportive land uses, so their drive-throughs are more permissive. Yeah.
Okay. Again, this was not something that there was an outcry for, but it was something that the planning department felt it was needed to codify.
Yeah, the problem is that people do their homework, so they try to come to us having read the code and present something that would be allowed, and because we don't include the methodology in the code, we've had a couple uncomfortable conversations where we had to say, like, we appreciate that you saw this, but actually this is how we measure it, and therefore it's not allowed, and we don't like to have to do that. So the more we can provide clarity in the code to customers, the more they can sort of do their homework on the front end.
That's all I have.
Thank you. I'm going to close the public hearing and a motion's in order. Commissioner Stern, do you want to make a motion?
Sure.
Oh, before we do that, is there anybody for public comment on this from the Zoom?
No, there
'Cause-
is not.
Okay. Commissioner Stern.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Article 11 of Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning requirements for mixed-use zone districts.
Is there a second? Second. We have a motion for approval, seconded by Commissioner Leo. Please poll the commission.
Motion approved, 7-0.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is 7B, which is case number ZOA 23-06, an ordinance amending Articles 5 and 9 of the Chapter 26, or 11, of Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing and making conforming amendments therewith. We'll move on to our staff presentation.
Thank you. So on April 6th, you saw a code amendment related to the parkland requirement associated with deed-restricted affordable housing. That created a waiver of that requirement. This is the second amendment in the series that implements the city's affordable housing strategy that got adopted in January. As you know, development is expensive and parking is expensive too. Just to give a point of reference, I don't think we put this in the memo, but it can be about $1,500 to $3,000 per parking space to build just a surface lot, and it's usually $20,000 or more per parking space for garage parking. So it's not cheap. In most cases, land obviously dedicated to parking can't be something else. It can't be building, can't be open space, can't be amenitized, which means it's sort of in everybody's best interest in a community to not overpark things. It's why we encourage shared parking a lot of times so that we don't, you drive around Wheat Ridge at certain times of the day and there's a lot of unused parking on the street, on private property. Generally speaking, I think Wheat Ridge parking requirements tend to be on the higher side. That's sort of owing to our history We were certainly felt more suburban at one point in time. We're an inner ring suburb, and I think a lot of our peer communities have refined their parking requirements. For our non-mixed use districts, our parking requirements are very high compared to peer communities. The mixed use code actually implemented maximum parking requirements. That was new in our community, and the reason for that is to make sure that we're not underutilizing sort of our prime real estate along Wadsworth and 38th Avenue and elsewhere. This code amendment proposes a three-pronged approach to reduce the minimum parking requirement for deed-restricted affordable, and it's shown in the table, sort of summarized in that table on the second page of the memo. So within a quarter mile of a train station or bus rapid transit. We don't have bus rapid transit in Wheat Ridge right now, so this would only apply right now at the commuter rail station. It would reduce the requirement to allow a minimum of one space for every 4 units. And then in just a general mixed-use zone district, it would reduce the requirement by half, so allowing 1 for every 2 units. And then in multi-unit projects, again, only if it's deed restricted, affordable, the requirement would reduce from down to 3/4 or 1 space per unit. We do a funky calculation in the R3 zone district. It's based on unit size, which is based on bedroom count. This doesn't change the requirements for ADA parking, for loading spaces, for visitor spaces. If a project is not fully affordable, so like Fruitdale is, I think, maybe 12 units and 5 of those are deed restricted, we'd calculate it the same as we do a multi-use building. We use 1 ratio for the deed restricted units and the regular ratio for the non-deed restricted units. The purpose here is really to allow flexibility. There's a lot of people who care about parking. The residents care, the bank cares. Often a bank or an investor will have a higher parking requirement than the zoning code. So the goal here is to just allow more flexibility and to allow the people who know the need to determine the need versus the city just having sort of this one-size-fits-all approach. I forwarded to you the comment from Foothills Regional Housing. They're obviously sort of the predominant developer of deed-restricted units in our community. We discussed this with council twice, actually. Parking is a sensitive subject in a community like ours. This is not sort of the first domino to fall of future parking amendments, but was sort of the narrow, specific recommendation out of our affordable housing strategy. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to take your questions, hear your comments.
Before we go to questions, I wanted to read an email that I sent to Lauren after she sent out the email in full transparency of what I said to Lauren about the parking situation. And I said, thanks for the email from, I think it was Amy from Foothills. I said, the problem I have with the lowering the parking standard is that we are telling people living in deed restricted housing that they need to use mass transit, which is not reliable or safe right now, and they really cannot own a vehicle. And like I mentioned, it could be a person with a work truck that has to go to a job off-site, or you have a single parent and a child, they have to get them to school or daycare, and they really can't own a vehicle. If they do own a vehicle, parking is going to be limited and will be on the street, so we're going to be pushing parking into the neighborhoods. And Wheat Ridge has a good reputation of, most of the neighborhoods that are single family, people use their driveways. There's not a lot of parking on the street like you see in North Denver where I grew up. I don't think this is really about parking. This is about increasing the density and kind of bypassing the zoning, and it's not really a quality of a project, it's a quality of life. It's really a developer wanting to use more of their land to build more units and create a denser project in the city. And so unless there's some kind of adjustments, Lauren mentioned there might be some changes, I really can't support this tonight. With that being said, I'll move on to questions and comments. I'll move on to Mr. Shelkey. Do you have any questions or comments? Commissioner Quinn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The comment I have is a little similar to yours, referencing somebody working with tools, and we have, the bus trying to get to a work site. In the construction trades, those jobs are rather transient. They're mobile, and they're not 9 to 5. Sometimes there's overtime that happens unexpectedly, and trying to catch a bus back or something like that back home can be hours or unreliable, as you had said. And so I am concerned about that, plus these folks have their own tools, lunchbox, gear, coveralls, you know, things of that nature. There's a lot of stuff, and taking it on the bus is not, I've seen guys do it, and it's a pain. And so that's just one concern I had of lowering those parking spaces down. And if you don't have one, by the time you get back home, now you gotta park down the street. Is your stuff gonna get stolen? Or do you gotta drag it all back up to the house or to the apartment or whatnot? So I agree with Mr. DiTullio. I'm not too sure I can support the parking space stuff at this time. Thank you.
Commissioner Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, Lauren, would this apply to a project, either R3 or maybe mixed use, or both?
Only if it is a deed restricted affordable project, meaning it's required to serve income qualified residents for some number of years,
So
usually.
a project like
10.
that could be built within an R3 zone,
Yes,
right? Or it could be built within a mixed-use zone.
right.
Okay.
They exist today in both zone districts and could exist in either
Right.
zone district, yeah.
Yeah, that's all I have on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Disney?
I guess my question is, and I have concerns about reducing the parking because the overflow will spill into the neighborhoods. I had this conversation earlier this evening with someone who isn't on the commission, but I just said my concern was we're going to start seeing more parking on the streets. But is deed restricted? How often does that occur? Is there a lot of deed restricted affordable housing, or is it a small number that this isn't going to create that much of an issue, or is it going to increase in the future and we're going to be bogged down by this ordinance so much so that we're going to start seeing a lot of parking in neighborhoods because of the nature of our community? And I know change is inevitable and we can't always hold on to things from the past, but so many people that live in this community want to maintain the character, which is not a lot of cars parking on the street.
Sure.
So multiple points in my question. Sorry if
Yeah.
it's too complicated.
There's not a lot of deed restricted affordable housing anywhere, or in Wheat Ridge. You know, Foothills Regional Housing is the primary developer of new deed restricted affordable in our community. Habitat does some, but they don't do multi-unit, and they don't develop in these zone districts. It's not a lot, but to the extent we desire affordable, deed restricted affordable housing, again, these are nurses, construction workers, bus drivers, you know, what was the number I heard the other day? I'm gonna get these wrong. I think 60 to 80% AMI is a $40,000 to $70,000 household. So these are people who do work, do contribute, and it's almost impossible to build housing for that population. So the goal here is is there anything we can do to make it easier to get deed restricted affordable housing in Wheat Ridge? And there's other things. We can provide money, we can provide land. We don't have a lot of those two things. And what you most often then go is to fee waivers or development density bonuses, which we can't do because we have this charter cap, or how can you better use the land, which is to look at how do we require they use it for either drainage, open space, parking, or building. Those are the four things that take up space, right? So parking is sort of the one that we identified in addition to the parkland waiver, where we can offer a little bit of flexibility. Deed restricted affordable is going to be very infrequent in a Wheat Ridge neighborhood because development is too expensive and our density limits are too limiting. So that's why this focuses predominantly on mixed use, which would end up being 38th or Wadsworth. Foothills Regional Housing has the Ives project, that's 50 units. That's a very low AMI. Nothing in here requires that people ride the bus, but that organization knows their tenants better than we do. So when they tell us we have 30 years of data for the parking ownership rates in our projects, their data is going to be better than ours, and so we just assume sort of create the flexibility in the code. The one thing I think we could do, which is what I responded to Mr. DiTullio, is that we just sort of dropped both the minimum and the maximum. We can leave the maximum at what it is for a regular residential. That essentially gives more range for an affordable developer to decide how much parking their population needs. No developer, market or affordable, is going to build a product that they can't lease. And they're going to build enough parking to ensure that they can lease their project and have happy people who want to renew a lease because it's expensive to change your tenants over time. So the goal here is to just be a little bit more market-based as it relates to sort of the affordable development community. Does that help a little bit? You asked a lot of questions, but that's the context from which we're coming from. Big projects, let's talk about sort of where else could affordable housing come. Lutheran is likely going to see affordable housing to the extent it develops as a residential use. It will probably be a planned development, so none of this really applies, right? They'll have to sort of come in and negotiate and explain why the parking is going to be what it is. So the places that we're looking here are Wadsworth. You know, if Foothills decides to build another building next to Ives, they can do shared parking there. They can figure out what they need. The parcels on 38th, they're probably too small because you've got to have some economy of scale when it comes to affordable development. So it's not going to be a lot.
So it's not going to be that big of an impact in going down in the future? You don't see that?
I don't foresee that.
So this may sound like a really silly question, but if it is half 0.25 spaces per unit, nobody drives a quarter of a car.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have 5 units with 10 people living in it, where do they park? What happens?
So it's a great question. It would be very unlikely to see a new deed restricted affordable project that's only 5 units. It's possible. So it's more likely that we'd see 5 units in a bigger project, and then there's sort of pooled parking. You can't say like this is only for the deed restricted spot. Federal fair housing would not allow that kind of thing to happen. We always round up, so in terms of the ratio for parking, we deal with that all the time. We always round up to the nearest whole parking space. But yeah, I mean, what that means, it's more likely to be on the scale of like 20 to 50 units. So 50 units that were deed restricted would only require, what, 13? I can't do that math. I should have picked a better number. I know.
She was just basing 5 off of 50 units. So every 5 units in the 50 is going to be 1 unit, 1 parking spot.
Every 4, yep. Yeah. But most of our mixed-use projects are in areas where the goal is that you can walk, bike, or take transit. In Denver, the requirement is 0. So we talked to council about Denver, about Albuquerque, about Phoenix, about the Western Slope, about a lot of peer communities. And we know that 0 would not fly. We talked about a lot of different numbers and where sort of the comfort zone is. So to the extent you have opinions on what it should be, I think that's what council is sort of listens to you on when you disagree with their sort of policy guidance. We've talked to them twice about this. These are the numbers they landed on. If you have other thoughts, we always forward those to council when we take it as a public hearing.
Commissioner Stern?
I have some thoughts.
Sure.
Just to be transparent, I'm not sure everyone knows, in my professional life, I'm a developer and I primarily work on deed restricted affordable housing. So I've worked in communities that have high parking requirements. I've worked in Denver. A couple of things I want to share is, one, I first want to highlight Lauren's point. Denver has changed their parking standard for affordable housing so that it is basically 0 for affordable housing. That does not mean that projects are happening with 0 parking. There are many, many layers of different, partners, agencies that get involved in how affordable housing gets put together, who all bring their own parking requirements. The most important is probably CHAFA, which is the agency that allocates tax credits. You can't build affordable housing, deed-restricted affordable housing without CHAFA. If you were going to provide less than 0.8 spaces per unit, CHAFA requires you to provide a parking study proving who's going to live in your community, what kind of parking needs they have. It's would be very challenging. I would be really surprised to see a project actually provide 0.25 spaces per unit following this. I kind of want to just give some context to, I think some of the questions are like, is this going to cause deed-restricted affordable housing to flood into Wheat Ridge to take advantage of this? This is not the thing that is going to make developers of deed-restricted affordable housing say, we're going to bring it all to Wheat Ridge. This is removing, in a very small way, a barrier that makes it really hard for deed-restricted affordable housing to happen in Wheat Ridge. And I'm obviously, this is what I do. I'm passionate about this. We have this housing plan that provides us with a vision and goals about providing a diversity of housing stock. I feel pretty strongly that we have a responsibility as a community to provide homes for all different kinds of people who want to be part of our community. And it's not going to happen unless we take these steps to remove barriers to feasibility. I'm working on a project in Denver right now that's right at a light rail station. I mean, literally steps from a light rail station. The costs in a very efficient building right now, it's about $300,000 a unit to build this housing, and Lauren said $20,000 for a structured parking space. We're actually hearing $50,000 for a structured parking space. So every single added space makes it harder to put together the projects that we need to support the workers that make our community run. I'll stop there.
Commissioner Leo?
For someone's annual income. Is that what you were saying, 40 to 70,000?
Yes, I mentioned that as a point of reference for what I think is our current 60 to 80% AMI, 1 to 2 person households.
Okay,
Yep.
so, I mean.
I think
know
there's just
affordable-
I mentioned it just as a point of reference because I think there's sort of an assumption that affordable is not working or is extremely low income, and that's just not the case in Jeffco today.
Yeah, I mean, I know affordable housing can refer to a lot of different groups.
Yep.
Okay, but someone at 40 to 70,000, they're gonna own a car. You're not gonna be able to have, no car. Even if they don't use it all the time, they're gonna have a car. So the minimum, one space, you're allowing that already. So in both of these categories, it's a minimum of one. So why would you even, not you, but why would the city think that you wouldn't need at least one space if that was an income level you were basically looking at?
Yeah, it's just not the case. I think it's an unfair assumption that everybody owns a car. And what we're seeing is that that's not the case, and there's a lot of data related to deed-restricted affordable housing that suggests that's not the case. It's not always 0.25, that's not what we're saying, but we're trying to allow the flexibility to sort of right-size the parking lot to make it negligibly easier to build deed-restricted affordable in Wheat Ridge.
Well, I mean, I get that, but at that, yeah, if you were talking about a different income group, I get that, but not at that. And a lot of the time, you've got two people living in the household. And one of them's got, I mean, I just don't know why you would just stick with the one minimum. That gives the developer the option of one space. And they probably would not pick the next.
So for the Ives project, so I'll give you a couple examples, because I think, again, the sort of assumption of what is affordable. Veterans, seniors, people in AMIs lower than 40, not usually two, not always owning a car, right? And so like the Ives project, it's a mixed income, average income project, it's 50 units, and they feel confident that they really only need 30 spaces because of the community members that they're serving. And we couldn't, the code is pretty black and white right now. So it allows us to be more customized based on the project. If the project serves a higher AMI, then yes, they're probably going to need more parking. And that is often something that can be negotiated with the lenders and the banks. I mean, again, the bank cares more about parking for a grocery store, for a restaurant, for a residential unit than we ever will from a zoning standpoint. They're always going to have higher requirements than what the city minimums are going to be. And that's why it feels like for this specific land use, we are not the expert on what is needed for a deed-restricted affordable project.
So,
Okay, thank you.
thank you. I guess my concern is, I agree with Commissioner Stern on most points. We agree. I don't see how we could, as a city, tell a single parent, well, you can't have a car if you're going to live here, or a worker. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me that we're telling people you don't have enough income to rent a regular apartment or house, so we're going to let you rent this at a lower rent, but you can't have a car, or if you do have a car, you're going to park it a block away. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, seniors can't ride bikes. So if they build a senior complex and we're going to have a lot of seniors living there, they're not going to ride a bike, and a lot of them aren't going to ride mass transit. So, and they may have one car. I just don't see why the city is trying to micromanage this parking situation. I think it should be based on each project. And the other concern I have is, you said that, you mentioned that it may be just new developments, but why couldn't the developer come in, buy a multifamily unit in the city of Wheat Ridge that has some land and say, okay, I'm going to tear down the parking, make it deed restricted and build another building, and then you got a deed restricted right in the middle of a neighborhood. And I can tell you they exist right now in the city where they're not deed restricted, but around 46th and Quay, the city or the county, I don't know when it happened, they built about 15 units over there. They're single family and they're single level. There's no parking. Everybody parks on the street, and when you're trying to get through that neighborhood, all the cars are on the street. They have 2 parking spots, and I don't know if the county allowed it or the city a long time ago. But so what happens? Can a developer come in, buy a multifamily complex, and say, well, we're going to scrape the parking, make it deed restricted, and build another building, and then push this traffic into the neighborhoods?
That's just not feasible.
Why not?
Deed restricting your residential community means that it makes less money and it's much harder to finance. So, like, this is not a sufficient incentive for somebody to take that path.
Maybe not right now, but maybe 5-10 years from now when prices change. I mean, we got the Foothills email saying if this passes, they can put more units, more density on that project or their projects. I mean, I'm not going to beat a dead horse because this is only a recommendation to city council, but do you have any other recommendations for numbers besides a quarter spot per I mean, can you?
Well, so, Lauren, something I'm thinking may be helpful if there's not enough support for this tonight is within the last 2 years, recently there have been 2 studies done on deed-restricted affordable communities in Denver that looked at actual parking utilization not in Denver, I mean in Metro Denver, looked at actual parking utilization in existing affordable communities and found like what people at these income levels actually are using in parking lots that tend to be too large. And that data is what the city of Denver looked at in changing their ratio. It's what we look at in planning communities and maybe sharing, Lauren, I'd be happy to share those studies if you don't have your hands on them. Maybe sharing those would be helpful.
I think that Foothills, it might have been the same study that Foothills shared with us, which is what we summarized to council, which is how we landed on these numbers. Yep. The .25, again, that's a stone's throw from a commuter rail station. It's not the one that would apply on Wadsworth. And I think your point is well taken, and we just see it differently. You said the city is micromanaging parking, and by requiring one, I think that the perception is we're micromanaging parking by requiring too high, and sort of if we can give them more flexibility, then they can decide where they need to land based on the project that they're building.
Well, my suggestion tonight is we take a motion and then look at amendments or more discussion. What would the commission like to do?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think that it's probably within the things that can be done to modify the requirements somewhat. You did mention possibly eliminating the minimums and just going with the max, and then leave some flexibility as the developer puts a project out there. The concern that limiting the number of parking spaces within an area would push parking out into the neighborhood, I think that is a valid concern. There probably are some other things that could be tweaked within some of the requirements for mixed use, of open space, some other things that might be considered that could be negotiated a little more of this, a little less of that, depending on what the project is. But I think as it stands now with this minimum requirement, I don't think I could support this.
So we could either take a motion or with amendments, or we can't postpone this for 2 weeks and come back with some
No, I think it'd be
recommendations.
best to sort of voice your opinions and recommendations, council. They're scheduled to hear it in about a month, so it wouldn't come back to you. And like you said, it's a recommendation to council, and we'll summarize sort of this discussion, and either a motion to approve, a motion to deny, or a motion for sort of a different approach.
So would somebody like to make a motion for approval or denial? The motion's in the packet. You just change a recommend approve to recommend deny, I believe, if you want.
Well, I believe we could formulate a motion that indicated that there are some ways that this could be modified or amended, that we essentially, we support the idea of addressing the affordable housing issue and mixed use, especially, given some of the restrictions that are in the code now, that tonight the Planning Commission believes that, we're kind of on the right track, we're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, the analogy that our city attorney sometimes uses is a Christmas tree. So I'll offer one option for a path forward would be somebody could read and second the motion in the packet. You wouldn't vote on that yet. And then if anybody wanted to, it's called an ornament, throw out an amendment, you can make an amendment and second the amendment. For example, if you wanted to change any specific numbers or clauses, then you can vote on those sort of ornaments one at a time, those amendments one at a time. That's one option if you have a specific change you'd want to see.
It would seem that if we were able to formulate something that at least sent a message, instead of just we're voting no, sent a message to the city council that said that, yeah, we understand the issue, we just don't we just don't approve of the way it is here.
Yeah, and if, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll give an example. Like an amendment could be with the following amendment that the minimum parking requirement for affordable within the quarter of a mile of a transit station is X, or it can be with the following amendment that the minimum required parking be increased above what is proposed in the ordinance, right? You don't have to be specific.
Or the minimum requirement is eliminated.
Is what?
Eliminated, and just have a maximum.
I think that would be tricky because the whole point of this is to change the minimum. The maximums exist. The maximums were reduced, so you could also do an amendment to say the maximum shall be restored to sort of standard rate for residential development.
Okay.
I have a question for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking back to when we had the vote on the plan for Lutheran. the Lutheran campus. And that is in place because it serves as a tool and a guideline that people can't rush in and develop willy-nilly in that area. And having listened to Commissioner Stern and your comments, I am inclined to support this because I understand that it is really more of a tool for negotiation and for flexibility. Unless the land use in this community changes drastically, there's just not a lot of places where we're going to see this kind of development unless a developer with deep pockets comes in and buys up a city block. I don't see that happening. That doesn't seem feasible. So my question is then, this really is basically going to give the city a little more leeway and flexibility in working with the developer and helping them to bring a project to fruition. A lot of other factors may come into play that the .25 space ends up being half a space, or after everything's said and done. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, it looks like we're kind of at an impasse here right now. Maybe I'll make a motion as chair, taking in some of the comments that have been made earlier, and then I think Commissioner Larson makes a good point. We should add additional information to the motion saying our concerns are this, and you've heard the concerns that are been posted probably in the minutes. So I'll try the motion and we'll see how it goes. I move to deny the recommendation of approval of the proposed ordinance amending Articles 5 and 11 of Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing and making confirming amendments with. I further move that council reevaluate the parking, the minimum and the maximum for deed-restricted housing in the city of Wheat Ridge.
I'll second that.
Discussion on the motion?
So if I understand correctly, the motion is to deny the recommendation.
Right, and then the council reevaluate some of the minimum and maximum recommendations in the ordinance
And that's not an amendment, it's just
as
a
part of the motion.
part of the motion.
So yeah, I guess to clarify, is the goal of this motion that rather than us trying to make specific tweaks here, that we're saying, council, please take this back to a study session, make tweaks, and then
Right,
a different ordinance would come before us later?
possibly, that'd be good.
Is that how it could
It
work?
could play out that way. Often, I think in the past, we've had other code changes that planning commission's not recommended approval of. And usually it's, the two I can think of have been taken under advisement but not sort of returned to study. So they'll see that any ordinance that goes to council has to go to a first reading. They'll see your recommendation and they'll either decide to sort of set the public hearing or return to a study session.
Commissioner Quinn, do you have a comment? Oh. So right now, we have a motion to deny, and also part of the motion is for council to reevaluate the minimum, maximum of parking requirements in the deed-restricted housing. Any more comments on the motion to deny and ask council to further analyze?
Chairman, I do know, I attended the study session and the council, and I do know this is a hot topic. We're not alone here. There were a lot of concerns with it as well. The same ones we had, overflow into the neighborhoods. Is it enough? Are we trapping people into these projects, if you want, I hate to use that word, but in these developments because they can't get out and get better jobs because those better jobs might be out of range of the mass transit or the light rail, and it makes it really difficult. We're not New York yet or Detroit, where there's a lot of transit options, and it does make it difficult on people to get better paying jobs to to keep moving up the ladder, I think. So this is a difficult thing, and I think it needs oddly enough, I never thought I would be so passionate about parking, but I think it would be, I think it's necessary to, look at this a little bit better, because there will be backlash from the citizens, because they are my neighbor gets really excited when someone parks in front of her house. Who are they? What are they doing here? Things of that nature. So I agree with the motion, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Shelkey?
I really think that, we got to look forward on this and think into the future. And we have to do whatever we can do to encourage affordable housing in Wheat Ridge. And if it means less parking spots in the development, then I think that might be the right way to go.
Tammy, do you have the motion? Do you need any more clarification on the motion for city council?
So I have that you denied it, and then with city council reevaluating the minimums and maximum parking requirements in deed restricted housing.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we vote? Please poll the commission.
So motion approved, 4-3.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is 7C, case number ZOA 23-07, an ordinance amending Articles 1 and 2 of the Chapter 26 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning definitions and regulations for child care facilities and making conforming amendments therewith.
Okay, change of topic, and welcome to the Care About Parking Club. I think as a commissioner, you'll never see the community in quite the same way. Like affordable housing, daycares are a major community need in Wheat Ridge and sort of metro-wide. And this code amendment actually, our code amendments come from sort of a variety of places. There might be sort of an egregious example and we're like, oh, that shouldn't have happened, we need to change the code. There might be sort of this lessons learned compendium like you saw for mixed use. The affordable parking is related to an adopted document. And then occasionally we just have sort of these gut check moments upstairs of like, this feels like the wrong answer. And a few times over the last couple years, we've had inquiries about daycare centers and it hasn't been allowed by the zoning code. And it's happened enough times now that we were like, this just doesn't feel right. So we brought the topic to council, since we're in a code amendment zone right now. And in terms of context, as you saw in the memo, the zoning code identifies two kinds of child care facilities, home-based and daycare centers, and then further differentiates between large and small. And we described in the memo sort of where each of those is allowed. And this amendment addresses three big topics. So the first is that daycare centers are not permitted right now in the neighborhood commercial and restricted commercial zone districts. And NC and RC are some of our legacy zone districts. We inherited those from the county. And the purpose of those two zone districts is to sort of smaller lots serving limited neighborhood serving commercial uses. You can't actually rezone to those two districts today, so we're not getting more of them, but they kind of exist where they do. At one point in time, we explored whether we should change all of those to mixed-use neighborhood, but that use chart is a little bit more wide-reaching than is appropriate. We included a map. It's a couple years old. We started this, we still don't have our mapping services back after the outage. So some of these NCRC properties have since rezoned to mixed-use neighborhood, but what you can see in that map is that they're generally along 44th and Harlan, and they're not really embedded in the neighborhood. We think those are properties where child care centers would be appropriate. They're smaller lots, some of those are converted homes. It seems like the right answer for us should be yes, that is a permitted use in a neighborhood commercial zone district. The second issue that this code establishes or addresses is a contradiction between state and local law. Essentially, some number of years ago, the state modified their thresholds for what is considered a large or a small daycare. All daycares, home-based, or centers are required to be licensed through the state and also get local business licensing and go through our permit inspection process. When those thresholds differ, it causes confusion. Ours is arbitrary, so we'd like to follow the state where their cutoff, I think, is at 15 or 16 kids. And then the final issue that this addresses relates to the presence of childcare at churches or the ability to sort of repurpose these bigger non-residential uses where they may actually be in a residential zone district. And what's come up, not surprisingly, is churches are big landowners. They're big empty buildings during most of the week, increasingly, and they're trying to find community partners who can use their properties. So we've had a couple instances of churches asking if they can pair up with a child care center. When the code has not been clear, we've interpreted to allow it as a special use. Child care as accessory use to a church is permitted. That used to mean sort of childcare during church service, send the kids to Sunday school. So what we're proposing in here is if you are pairing a daycare center with a sort of active other use, place of worship or school, it's permitted, where a child care center might move into a vacated non-residential structure, but in a residential zone, and there's a map for that too, it would require special use permit. So that's the discretionary approval where we get to say, what are your hours, what is your parking, what are the impacts gonna be? But in short, we're trying to sort of make it a little bit easier for childcare to be accommodated in properties where we think they're appropriate, as illustrated on those two maps. Again, that last page of your packet is the places of worship. This map is a little older too, but I think is still pretty current. And again, you see most of those at sort of key corners or on collector streets, so not too embedded in the neighborhood in most cases. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Questions? Commissioner Leo? Commissioner Stern? Commissioner Disney? Commissioner Larson?
Just thank you, Mr. Chairman. This does seem like as much a housekeeping as anything else, and certainly recognizes the need for childcare in our community. The question I have has to do with the idea of neighborhood commercial and restricted commercial, and whether there's ever been any thought of maybe doing some sort of legislative cleanup with those districts, because they don't really seem to do much.
I think, yes, you're right. It was a few years ago, we looked at each property to say, like, could we do a legislative rezone of all NC and RC to MUN? MUN allows townhomes, 3-story development, and what we didn't want is to sort of make that the de facto use that would be likely attracted to those sites. What I think we need to do is review the permitted use chart for those 2 zone districts and allow potentially, we call them third places, so like expanded uses that would be supportive of a neighborhood where you can walk to a smoothie shop or you could walk to a coffee shop or whatever that is. I think we probably need to do that as a part of a more comprehensive review of the commercial use chart, and that's probably most appropriate once we go through some of the comp plan process over the next 2 years, right? What do you want to see in your neighborhood versus somewhere that you'd have to bike or drive to? So I think that's probably a phase 2, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Quinn, questions?
No real questions. I think this is a good idea. In the office I work at, 3 or 4 of the ladies there are starting off with families, and something close to home or close to work for daycare is necessary, and it's a good thing, especially when kiddos get sick in the middle of the day. It makes it easier for them to get home and get the kids. So I support this.
Commissioner Shelkey?
The lack of daycare is not just a small problem, it's a huge problem. And the affordability of daycare is a huge problem. And anything we can do to move in the right direction on that, we should do.
On the lack of daycares, would that be a symptom of COVID and a lot of places shutting down and workers not returning back to daycare because of low pay? And, I mean, have you heard anecdotally why there's less daycare centers across the metro area as a staff person and?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm probably know it more as a mom.
That's
There's, I think that the volume of daycares has not kept up with the population growth or population shift in the metro area. And I would say that pay of teachers is horrible and daycare workers is abysmal. And so the turnover, I mean, I think when you couldn't staff them, I know anecdotally that there are some childcare centers that just never reopened. It's hard to run a childcare center, and yeah, I mean, my kids were on wait lists, and it's just, I don't know what the fix is, yeah.
Commissioner Disney, would you like to make a motion?
Before you do, just one quick question. It's sort of a chicken and egg. Each one of these definition changes describes a facility licensed by the state of Colorado. Would you apply for a license for the state of Colorado if you are not going to be able to build, you're not going to be able to open in a restricted commercial or something like that? I mean, how by definition, if you have a license, you have a facility, but the state's not going to issue a license if you don't.
Yeah, so usually what we see happen, and it's similar to other kinds of businesses who have to get like a inspection from the health department, usually the first inquiry is to the city to say, I'm looking at this address for a possible daycare, is it permitted and what would I need to do? And then they'd initiate the state process sort of in parallel with the city process. Yeah, it's a little iterative, you're right.
Any other questions before we take a motion? Commissioner Disney, a motion is in order.
Did you say dizzy?
Disney.
I move to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amending Articles 1 and 2 of the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws concerning definitions and regulations for child care facilities, making conforming amendments therewith.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion, it's seconded by Commissioner Shelkey. Please poll the commission.
Motion approved, 7-0.
Thank you. That concludes our business agenda. We'll move on to new business. I believe that's our esteemed director now.
Thank you. New business. So yes, I wanted to welcome Commissioner Quinn as well. I got to know Commissioner Quinn through Wheat Ridge 101, which if you haven't taken it, even though you all know a lot about the city, I'm sure he can give you some reviews. Did you want to introduce yourself at all? You're good? You met everybody? That's fine. Don't have to put you in the hot seat. I also want to introduce, not here in person, but we have hired a planning manager. So at our next meeting, likely late June or in July, we won't have the June 1st meeting. Jana Easley is going to come to us from Lafayette. She's worked in a few different municipalities, lots of experience in planning, fair amount of experience as a planning manager, as an interim director as well. She's got a real estate broker license. She was a paralegal. She sort of hits all of the different topics that we cover in planning, current planning, long-range planning, community engagement, affordable housing, all the things. So we're really excited. She'll be starting right after Memorial Day, so I look forward to introducing you all to her. Permit and commercial tenants, just a couple new tenants you've probably noticed before I have given these updates, but the Cyclery Yacht opened on 38th Avenue. They got their, or I signed the certificates of occupancy. I think they did actually open as well. We also signed the certificate of occupancy for the Get Right Bakery on 38th Avenue. Gold's Market still has a number of tenants under review, sort of to open in the future, but I understand they're having a block party to sort of celebrate the tenants that have opened so far, so that's June 3rd. And I'm pretty sure Local Works has more information on that. And then a save the date for June 24th is Ridge Fest. In case we don't have a June meeting, I wanted to put those on the record. And then Commissioner Larson asked me to respond to a Denver Post article that Get Right Bakery, they were in, I think, Westward and maybe the Denver Post, and they made a comment about permitting delays. So there were a couple of unique things that occurred for their project. That sort of created a perfect storm. It was a delayed review, longer than we have for most projects and longer than we'd want for them. They submitted before our outage, so this security outage created about a month delay, for any permit that was under review because we just didn't have access to any files. there was some poor communication, I think, on our end with the plan reviewer who's not with the city anymore, about a unique scenario in their project. They use really cool ovens from Italy, but the mechanical system in these sort of custom ovens is different than what we see in a traditional commercial kitchen. So it created a little more back and forth and some communication challenges. Once they got their permits, they were done in less than 3 months, so it went really quickly, and they are a great addition to the community. So that was all the updates that I had, I think.
Lauren,
Yeah.
I don't think we will be having any meetings in June.
Any meetings in June? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I missed a vision meeting this week. Thank you for that update. No meetings in June.
Wow.
I have a question.
Yes.
And I think I asked you this last year. I have noticed in a lot of new developments, commercial developments in town, that a lot of the trees are dead. And is there any requirement from the city for the developer to go back and replace dead trees? or-
Yes.
Okay.
So we actually have a program and a full-time staff person who does that now. So before COVID started, we created a pilot program which used temporary summer help. We called it our landscape maintenance inspection program because the code requires that you plant trees. We go back and forth a lot on landscape plans. The code requires that you maintain trees, but then often as soon as a tree blocks a sign, it gets chopped down or things just die. It's in a developer's best interest to sort of replace them within the first usually 2 years because most plantings come with a warranty. And so we have a gal who's our landscape planner, full-time position, and so every summer we identify usually about 60 properties that we go and do an inspection against the approved landscape plan. We identify not can you do exactly what was previously approved, but we identify issues. What's missing? What's dead? Why is it dead? Did we pick the wrong species? Can we help you better irrigate? She's a wizard. I have a black thumb. She's incredible. And so it's really more of a service than an enforcement issue of like, how can we problem solve with you to be meeting our code requirements? We've had incredible success rates. There's only one project in 5 years. We skipped during COVID. We left that position vacant. Only one project in 5 years where it's been a little bit more adversarial, shall we say. So yes, we're working on it. If there's a project or property that you specifically notice that you think needs attention, let us know. We can't cover them all in one season, but she covers a lot in one season, and we just made the list now that everything is blooming and growing, and we can tell the difference between dormant and dead. So yeah, I'd love to know about those kinds of properties. Yeah.
Lauren, isn't the Parks and Rec still have the program going where if you have a dead or dying tree on your property, private property, that they can apply for a grant that either removes the tree and then you can apply for new trees as well?
Yes. Yeah, it was a wildly successful program. If you go to rootedinfund.com, which is the Parks Department website, and look up dead trees, I think they'd have more information on that, yeah.
So to the public, if you have a dead or dying tree, you could contact the city. They'll come out and evaluate it. There's a grant program to have the tree removed, and there's also a grant program to have a new tree replace it, and that's citywide on private property, mainly residential, I think. So it's there. It's been a couple of years that it started.
It's the Hazardous Tree Grant Program is the one if you need to remove it. And yeah, call the Parks Department if you've got questions, because it was very well received. I think it was oversubscribed the last couple of years. It was great, so we've continued it.
I worked with council on that one.
Nice.
It was fun. So on old business, is that considered commissioners' matters?
Sure.
Okay. So I'll move on to old business. Commissioner Leo, any comments, questions? Commissioner Stern?
Question maybe just for our next meeting. I would just love to hear an update on the Wadsworth construction and kind of like how it's going compared to expectations, current anticipated schedule. Curious.
Yeah, I'm peripherally involved, so I don't know most of that off the top of my head, but I can bring an update next time. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Disney. Commissioner Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this tree grant thing is interesting. I will follow up with that. But I did have a question on when I watched this last study session this last Monday for the City Council. And toward the end of it, Manager Goff mentioned that Foothills Regional Housing is interested in the property behind Safeway. And when we reviewed that property, it was with the understanding this was going to be market rate housing, market rate buildings. And then for the city, and it sounds like Commissioner Goff has mentioned that there is money in the budget to assist Foothills with the purchase of that, providing the city with some benefits there. But I guess my concern is that if a developer comes in and tells the commission that a project will be one thing and then turns around right before it's finished and sells it as something else. It just, I guess there's a, and there's no way, there's really no way to have a crystal ball to look at what happens a year and a half down the road when the project is finished. But if there is maybe some way in going forward, whether there might be something we as a commission could add to a discussion that says, okay, you come in here and you say you're going to develop a project that will be market rate, and then they turn around and do something else, that there's some, I don't know, some alternative.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, until tonight and April 6th, there was no differentiation in our code of whether it's market rate residential or not, or senior housing or not. Our code looks like grocery stores. It could be Aldi, it could be Trader Joe's. It's a residential unit, it could be deed restricted, it could be market. So we have never regulated that, nor can we. I think I would be concerned more if it was in the reverse, if somebody committed affordable and changed it to market rate. In this case, it's my understanding that the property went up on the fair market, and the person who's most interested in it happens to be the operator of affordable housing, because it is cheaper to buy that than to build new affordable units under today's construction costs and interest rates. So I don't think it was intended to be a bait and switch. I think it's a terrific opportunity for a buyer, who in this case happens to be able to operate it at affordable. It doesn't change, the project's done, right? So they're not going to take out parking.
Well, that was my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Does that change
No.
the
No.
parking requirements?
No. And the rules apply equally. I mean, our esteemed director of Foothills Regional Housing will say, you can't treat me differently than a Confluent, than a Tyler Downs, right? The same rules apply. The architectural rules are the same. The open space rules are the same. You know, they have to compete for lending and for labor in the same way as any other developer. So we actually think it's a great project for them, because it's also close to some of their other properties, and so from an efficiency standpoint, and those are tiny units. They're really small units. I think it would be hard to price that for market rate because their studios are just itty bitty. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Quinn?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Happy to be here and excited to be a part of the city. Since I'm no longer the president of my local union, I've got a lot more time on my hands, so I got involved here with the city and found out a whole lot of things I didn't know about Wheat Ridge, all the different opportunities that are here. For instance, the local works, getting the dumpster neighborhood cleanup grant thing. I'm doing that next Saturday, so come on by.
What's the neighborhood?
I'm off of Moore, 3995 Moore Street. And so we're going to have a little party that Saturday night, and hopefully the mayor and Councilman Weaver and Stites come on by, and maybe Chief Murtha. But anyways, the Wheat Ridge has a lot of opportunities and things that I didn't know about, and I'm real excited about getting involved at this level. Thank you.
Commissioner Schuelke?
No, I'm good.
Thanks, I'll be quick. I understand what Commissioner Stern is mentioning about it's costing a lot of money to build these days. It's doubled or tripled. And I understand that we need to look at ways to encourage affordable housing. And is it true that the Wheat Ridge Housing Authority is coming back online Lauren, is that true?
It is not yet determined what their role will be. It is true that we are asking council on Monday for a new position to have a housing program administrator, I think we called it. And it would be through their sort of expertise that we'd figure out what the role of the Wheat Ridge Housing Authority would or could be.
So I'm not being critical, but I think changing parking to save some money for a developer, it's a Band-Aid. And I think that what we should look at is, we just approved a while back a deed restricted on remodeling. They got some grant, the property owner got grant money, and then they were able to remodel their units, and then they're deed restricted on the rent. So I don't understand why we can't do that, something with new builds on deed restricted, that they can apply for grant money. I mean, there's only two ways to get affordable housing, is you subsidize it or you build cheaply. And you don't want to build cheaply, obviously, but if you subsidize it and they use grant money from the city or from other different sources, that's how I think we can make a real impact, instead of just trying to change parking or open space or, these small things that really don't matter, or, free demolition permits or whatever it takes to help them do their job. And I think that if we have a developer who wants to come in, and we did it with the Town Center Apartments, that was subsidized by HUD. And so they saved money. They actually bought the land with some of that money that we did back in so I would say that rather than looking at Band-Aids in general, and I'm not being critical of what happened, I'm just saying, let's look at the bigger picture and say, if we want affordable housing, you're gonna have to subsidize it, and the city's gonna have to subsidize it, or the state, or, we get grants from the state or from the federal government. And that's how you can make a real difference in the community. Then you're not telling somebody, well, you can't have a car if you want to live here, or you have to ride a bike when you're 75 years old. I think that's where the subsidizing of new buildings would be actually awesome, and then everybody wins. And, as a taxpayer, I'd rather see my taxpayer money go towards that than anything else as a citizen of the community. So that's just my 2 cents, if you want to mention it to the council when they hear this again.
That is front and center in the affordable housing strategy, which has about a dozen things we know tonight is sort of small potatoes, but I think at the end of the day, it all adds up. And yes, subsidizing is necessary for any affordable project, and that's the city's goal, is to figure out what can be that sustainable revenue stream.
Commissioner Larson?
We've got our first Miller's moth flying around the chambers here.
It's coming over to Commissioner Disney.
Lauren, real quickly, would you recap for us I did see an announcement about either groundbreaking or a ribbon cutting for Miller Street housing, Habitat for Humanity.
I think they had a groundbreaking in March for the duplexes that Habitat is building. They're on Miller, north of 44th, so they're underway. I haven't driven past there lately, but yeah, the groundbreaking was in March.
Yeah, no, you go on the website and there's no address, so I wasn't able to kind of pin it down where it's actually located.
It's just north of Compass, Montessori, sorry.
I mean, it's over by Sprouts. It's cat a corner
Sprouts.
on
Oh,
38,
okay. I was looking in the wrong place then, yeah.
I think it's
isn't it? Miller?
I think it's
over
44th.
I think
It's
it's
just
on-
north of 44.
just.
there? It's on 44?
It almost seems deliberate. They don't have include an address on the webpage. It's a little frustrating. You dig around, you're like, where is
I
this?
think it's once you sign up to volunteer, you get all the information that you need,
Sure.
but I think they usually try to be pretty
Yeah.
protective. I mean, also, again, to the earlier point, like, you don't advertise, this is affordable housing, right? So they're trying, often once they've identified a family partner and trying to sort of walk that fine line of supportive community members and volunteers and sort of the privacy of
And
those
how many
community
duplexes?
members. I forget if it's 3 or 4, maybe 4
Oh,
duplexes.
It's not a big development. Okay. All right, great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, is there a motion to adjourn? We have a motion to adjourn, is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Leo. Please poll the commission.
Motion approved, 7-0.